This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. A carbon footprint is the amount of carbon dioxide pollution that we produce as a result of activities. Some people try to reduce their carbon footprint because they are concerned about climate change. Now, researchers have a way for people to measure how much nitrogen pollution they produce. Their nitrogen footprint. All plants and animals need nitrogen. Nitrogen is a major element in the proteins in our bodies. The atmosphere is mostly nitrogen. In the early 20th century, scientists learned how to take nitrogen out of the air and make it into a form that plants could use. University of Virginia professor Jim Galloway calls synthetic nitrogen fertilizer a wonderful invention because it increased food production. But he says many parts of the world use too much nitrogen fertilizer, and that harms the environment. He says the effects include air pollution, acid rain, loss of biodiversity, coastal dead zones, and global warming. So Professor Galloway and other researchers have developed a nitrogen footprint calculator. This web-based tool asks people about the foods they eat and questions like how much they fly and drive and how big a house they live in. Researchers say the average American produces 42 kilograms of nitrogen pollution a year. Some of that comes from fossil fuels like oil and coal, but more than 70% involves food. University of Virginia researcher Allison Leach says Americans eat almost twice as much protein as the government recommends. She says eating only the recommended levels could reduce nitrogen footprints by almost half. Professor Galloway says animal protein plays a big part. He points to the example of cattle that are given feed grown with nitrogen fertilizer. For large animals like beef, a very large fraction of the nitrogen that enters the cow's mouth is excreted out the back end, he says. Last year, a study supported by American beef producers found that their industry's environmental impact has decreased over the past 30 years. Jude Capper at Washington State University reported that by producing more beef from fewer animals, the industry cut its carbon footprint by 18%. The nitrogen calculator is currently designed for people in the United States, Germany, and the Netherlands. Another online calculator will be designed for India. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Presutti. For more ways to learn American English and stay informed every day, go to voaspecialenglish.com from your computer or mobile device.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Last week, our subject was illegal fishing. Now, we report on two cases where fish are both the victims and the offenders. The first involves two kinds of Asian carp, bighead and silver. They can grow more than a meter long and weigh up to 45 kilos. They eat huge amounts of plankton that other fish need to survive. Silver carp can also jump high and hit people in boats. Asian carp were brought to the United States in the 1970s as a solution. They were imported to eat algae and other microscopic organisms. They were put to work as cleaners at fish farms along the Mississippi River and in wastewater treatment systems. But now the fish are moving north toward the Great Lakes. They are making their way up a system built years ago to link the Mississippi to Lake Michigan. The dangers of an invasion are environmental and economic. The destructive carp could spread within the Great Lakes and threaten fishing and trade. The Army Corps of Engineers has put an electric fence in the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. The underwater barrier is meant to shock the carp into turning back. Only one Asian carp was found among many thousands of fish killed with poison while part of the fence was being serviced. The barrier, however, may not be enough to protect the Great Lakes. There are calls in Congress for emergency action. Officials could close shipping connections between Lake Michigan and the upper Mississippi River system. But there are no decisions yet. So, that is the situation in the Midwest. Farther west, the problem is with common carp. Officials in Utah want to remove around 3/4 of the carp from Utah Lake. The lake near the city of Provo is the largest natural body of fresh water in the state. The state wants to remove millions of carp to protect an endangered species native only to Utah Lake, the June suckerfish. The carp eat plants that the suckers use as hiding places. Carp were first put into the lake in the 1880s as a food source. Now there are so many, experts say up to 20 metric tons a day could be removed with nets over a period of several years. But officials are fishing for ideas about what to do with all those fish, which could get pretty smelly. Ideas include using them to fill land, making them into liquid fertilizer, or letting people eat them. You can share your own suggestions at voaspecialenglish.com. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. In May, American officials suspended all fishing in parts of the Gulf of Mexico because of the huge oil spill. The restrictions gave scientists time to study the effects on seafood in the Gulf. The order extended from the mouth of the Mississippi River in Louisiana east to waters of Pensacola Bay in Florida. The affected waters include areas off the coasts of Mississippi and Alabama. On April 20th, an oil drilling rig, the Deepwater Horizon, exploded and sank about 80 kilometers from the Louisiana coast. BP is trying different ways to stop the leak from a damaged undersea well and control the spilled oil. The chief of British Petroleum blames failures by the rig's operator, Transocean of Switzerland. But BP says it will pay cleanup costs and all legitimate claims for losses and damages from the spill. BP is also hiring local fishing boats to help with the cleanup. 80% of the seafood eaten by Americans is imported, but the fishing industry in Louisiana is responsible for about a third of all seafood caught in the United States. The fishing ban did not affect state waters west of the Mississippi River. Those waters represent 77% of Louisiana's total seafood production. Ewell Smith from the Louisiana Seafood Promotion and Marketing Board says seafood from the unaffected area is safe to eat. Seafood is worth nearly $2.5 billion to the state. The spill happened shortly before the start of the fishing season for crab, shrimp, and oysters. Louisiana is the nation's leading producer of shrimp, oysters, crabs, crawfish, and alligators. Louisiana is also one of the world's largest producers of what some call the most important fish you've never heard of, menhaden. Menhaden and its oil are used in animal feed and other products. Another important industry along the Gulf is tourism. Coastal communities waited and watched for oil to arrive on their shores. Bad weather interfered with efforts to send out boats to clean up the oil and watch for the effects on wildlife in the Gulf of Mexico. Bird populations are among those at risk of being poisoned by the oil. Bird rescue groups set up stations, but they say finding injured birds in the huge spill and sending out boats to rescue them is a difficult job. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. You can find more reports about agriculture at voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Advice on how much fertilizer to use will soon be just a phone call away for rice farmers in the Philippines. The Philippine Department of Agriculture and the International Rice Research Institute plan to launch a free service in September. Farmers will call a number and a recorded voice will ask them simple questions in Tagalog or other languages, including English. For example, to get fertilizer guidelines for the wet season, they press 1. For the dry season, they press 2. Farmers will be asked about the size of their field and how many bags of rice it produced last year. What about natural sources of fertilizer? Does the farmer return rice straw to the field? Is the field near a lake or river that floods, or in a low area collecting soil and other material from nearby hills? About 10 minutes later, the farmer will get a text message. The message will advise what kind of fertilizer to use and how much. The grower will also get suggestions about when to plant and harvest the rice. Roland Burish at the International Rice Research Institute helped develop the system. Mr. Burish says fertilizer represents about 1/5 of the cost of inputs for rice production. He says the service could help farmers in the Philippines increase their yields and their profits. Danielle Nierenberg at the World Watch Institute, an environmental research group, says the system could also help reduce pollution. She said in the Philippines and all over Asia, fertilizer has been overused and misused because no one explains to farmers how much they need or how to use it. The technology could also be copied for crops in other places. Danielle Nierenberg has been traveling across sub-Saharan Africa. She says the cost of a cell phone there is low enough that most farmers have their own or borrow someone else's. In Zambia, for example, farmers without bank accounts can use their phones to buy seeds and fertilizers. They can also get information on how much their crop is selling for in city markets. She said they can decide whether they want to travel from their village to the city, because sometimes farmers get there and prices are too low. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. You can post comments on our website, voaspecialenglish.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at VOA Learning English. This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. There are growing concerns about food insecurity in the developing world. Rising food prices, weather emergencies, and political problems are deepening the struggles of families in many countries. 3 United Nations agencies published a report before World Food Day in October. This year's State of Food Insecurity in the World report says high prices are likely to continue. Gregory Barrow with the World Food Program in Rome says, if you look at the places where World Food Program works, particularly in developing countries, you see populations of people who might be spending 60, 70, 80% of their salaries on purchasing food for their families. The report says even short-term price increases can have a long-term effect. Reducing nutritious food early in a child's life can affect mental and physical development and limit future earnings. The United Nations has programs aimed at reducing the number of hungry people in the world by 50% by 2015. But most observers say this target is unlikely to be reached. East Africa is suffering its worst drought in years. In Kenya, at least 3.5 million people are going hungry, mostly in the north. Yet food is going to waste in central Kenya. Now, farmers there want the government to buy their food and get it to those in need. Farmers say bad roads and a lack of transportation make it difficult for them to get their produce to market. Storage is another problem, and they complain about a big drop in food prices. Nahashan Gitao farms almost 3 hectares, about a 90-minute drive from Nairobi. He says he regrets that he wastes at least 25% of his harvest while other Kenyans are hungry. He says the government should buy his food at a good price instead of asking for food from overseas. Economists say the imports reduce local food prices, decrease productivity, and increase dependency among the people. Mr. Gitao says if he could receive higher prices for his crops, he could feed more Kenyans. A Kinangop district official said her office does not get enough money from the central government to improve roads and take other steps to help farmers reach markets. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. Our programs are a way for people to read, listen, and learn American English and much more. You can download transcripts and MP3s of our stories at voaspecialenglish.com. From VOA Learning English, this is the Agriculture Report. Agriculture produces a lot of the heat-trapping gases that scientists link to rising temperatures and climate change. Agriculture also can be hurt by the effects of climate change. The World Watch Institute in Washington suggests ways that agriculture can reduce its effects on the environment. World Watch released a report called Innovations in Sustainable Agriculture, Supporting Climate-Friendly Food Production. Researcher Danielle Nierenberg was one of its authors. She says 25 to 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. This is because fertilizers, pesticides, antibiotic drugs, transportation, and processing are all dependent on oil, gas, and coal. Danielle Nierenberg says animal production has an especially big effect on the environment. She notes that more meat is being eaten in countries like Brazil, China, and India. As a result, more industrial factory farms are being built in the developing world. The report recommends 6 land and water use practices that it says are sustainable. These include growing trees on farmland to reduce soil erosion and planting cover crops to protect soil from drought, heat, and pests. Danielle Nierenberg says urban farming can help as well. Growing more food in cities can reduce transportation costs, she says. Urban residents then can buy food from within their communities. Other recommendations include recycling wastewater in cities, drip irrigation, and catching and storing rainwater. The United Nations estimates that changes in the agriculture industry could cut its carbon dioxide production by 88%. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. A cash crop is a crop grown for money. 400 years ago, the first cash crop for European colonists in North America was tobacco. American Indians were already growing it. Then in 1612, says tobacco.org, an Englishman named John Rolfe found that it would grow well in Virginia and sell profitably in England. But tobacco kills millions every year. Farmers face increasing government restrictions on tobacco use. They also face less demand from developed countries and more competition from developing ones. Some farmers now grow niche crops instead of or in addition to tobacco. Niche crops are aimed at a particular market, but choosing what to plant can be difficult. Professor Tony Johnston at Middle Tennessee State University says most tobacco farms are relatively small. The big issue for all of the tobacco-growing states is to find those small crops, those niche crops, that would provide enough cash flow with fairly similar amounts of area on which you plant your crops. Some tobacco farmers raise prawns or freshwater shrimp. This kind of shellfish is used in different foods and often served cold in what Americans call shrimp cocktails. The British call them prawn cocktails. Tennessee farmer Jane Corbin says she got into this aquaculture business because it sounded interesting. On a recent weekend, she and her sons harvested tobacco and prawns from the same field. The prawns grew for 5 months in a pond. The Corbins also raise cattle, along with flowers, vegetables, and other crops. Jane Corbin got into aquaculture in the late 1990s. Other tobacco farmers in the American South gave it a try because state and federal agencies were encouraging a change. It was advertised as an alternative to your tobacco crop as far as your income was concerned. That did not ring true. That wasn't why I got into it, but a lot of people did, and they saw that that was not a fact. Still, Professor Johnston says tobacco farmers are realizing they cannot depend on a single crop. The niche crops that seem to enjoy the most success, he says, are those that get consumers to visit the farm. G. James has bought prawns from the Corbins for years and enjoys helping with the harvest. It's their kindness and their genuine spirit that I keep on coming back here. What she especially likes, she says, is that the prawns are from right there in Tennessee. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Pursuti.
I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Not all research begins with a plan. Some studies begin by accident. Meredith Schaefer says that is what happened with her and Cynthia Sagers. Cynthia Sagers is a biology professor at the University of Arkansas. Meredith Schaefer is a graduate student. They were traveling in the state of North Dakota on a project. They noticed pretty yellow flowers. They recognized them as canola. Farmers grow canola for seeds to make cooking oil. Canola is also used for animal feed and biofuel. But the canola plants they saw were not growing in farm fields. They were growing along the road. The researchers decided to test the plants. They had brought along special testing papers for the project they were working on. They crushed some of the leaves in water and added the test strips. The results showed that the weedy canola plants contained genetic changes. If a plant is genetically modified, that means its genes have been changed to produce desired qualities. This past summer, the researchers from Arkansas went back to North Dakota. This time, they went on a road trip to find canola. They traveled more than 5,000 kilometers. They stopped about every 8 kilometers to count plants and take samples to test in their vehicle. What they found, they say, was the first discovery in the United States of wild canola plants with modified genes. Meredith Schaefer presented the findings at a recent meeting of the Ecological Society of America. The scientists found canola plants in almost half of the places they investigated. They tested a total of 288 plants. They found that 80% of those plants contained genes from genetically engineered canola. Some crop plants are modified to resist damage from the chemicals that farmers spray to kill weeds. There are 2 proteins that can give canola the ability to resist 2 commonly used herbicides. One protein gives resistance against glyphosate. The other protein gives resistance against glufosinate. 2 of the plants growing in the wild showed resistance to both kinds of weed killers. Professor Sagers says canola varieties with these genetic qualities have not been released on the market. This suggests the result of wild populations reproducing on their own. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can read and listen to our programs at voaspecialenglish.com. I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. The United States is making the first major changes in its food safety rules since the 1930s. A new law called the Food Safety Modernization Act will govern all foods except meat, poultry, and some egg products. It calls for increased government inspections of food processors, and it lets the Food and Drug Administration order the recall of unsafe foods. That agency has only been able to negotiate with manufacturers to remove products from the market. The new law also increases requirements for imported foods. But the law excludes small farmers and processors from the same rules as large producers. And it does not require sellers at farmers markets and food stands to meet the highest requirements. That pleases Susan Perlman, director of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. She said a one-size-fits-all approach would have put small farmers and ranchers out of business, or it would have prevented them from providing locally produced, healthy, fresh food to consumers. The Consumer Federation of America says it is generally pleased with the new law. So is much of the food industry. But Republican Representative Jack Kingston of Georgia questioned whether enough people get sick from food to justify the spending. The legislation could cost the government almost $1.5 billion over 5 years. In December, federal officials lowered their estimates of how many Americans each year get sick from food. The new estimates are 48 million, or 1 in 6 people. 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die. The old estimates included 76 million illnesses and 5,000 deaths. Experts at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention made their last estimates in 1999. Officials say the difference is largely the result of improvements in data and research methods. They say the two estimates cannot be compared to measure trends. Yet one thing has not changed. About 80% of illnesses spread by food are still listed as having been caused by unspecified agents. In other words, no one really knows which bacteria, viruses, or other organisms were responsible. But in cases with a known cause, The experts say salmonella is responsible for more than 1/3 of hospitalizations, and it causes more than 1/4 of deaths. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. From VOA Learning English, we bring you news about agriculture in Special English. Each year, bad food sickens about 1 in 6 Americans, but proposed new rules raise hopes to improve food safety. Officials say the changes could prevent more than 1 million cases of food-related illnesses each year. The new rules were proposed recently, exactly 2 years after President Obama signed the Food Safety Modernization Act. The rules are the first step in putting that law into effect. They represent the biggest changes in food safety since the 1930s. The new law makes the Food and Drug Administration responsible for preventing foodborne illnesses. Experts say this is a change in the way that the FDA has dealt with disease outbreaks in the past. Congress passed the law after a series of outbreaks that were linked to spinach, peanut butter, and other foods. The agency is proposing to require food manufacturers to show that they have identified where contamination is most likely to happen. Manufacturers would also have to show that they have taken steps to prevent problems. The proposed rules also deal with safety in growing and harvesting fruits and vegetables. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that establishing all of the provisions of the law will cost the government $1.4 billion. The Grocery Manufacturers of America, an industry group, has not released an estimate of what it will cost producers. But FDA Deputy Commissioner Michael Taylor says the new rules are worth the cost. He says there should be reductions in illness and disruptions in the food supply and increases in buyer confidence. He says when these issues are considered, the benefits outweigh the costs of the new law. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Scientists have discovered more details about how plants use water. Their findings could help to engineer plants that grow better and more effectively in conditions with higher levels of carbon dioxide. Plants naturally take in carbon dioxide they need for photosynthesis, the process of changing light energy to chemical energy. The carbon dioxide enters the plants through tiny holes or pores on the surface of leaves. However, each time a plant takes in 1 molecule of carbon dioxide gas, it loses hundreds of water molecules. Scientists say plants lose 95% of the water they take in through these pores. Some plants' pores can tighten to save water during conditions of high carbon dioxide. Other plants are not able to do this as well. Now, scientists know how these tiny pores tighten in plants. Julian Schroeder is a professor of biology at the University of California, San Diego. Mr. Schroeder says that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are much higher now than they were in the past, However, he says, many plants are not closing their pores in order to hold in more water. He and his team have identified proteins that control the tightening of a plant's pores. The proteins are enzymes called carbonic anhydrases. The findings were published in the journal Nature Cell Biology. Mr. Schroeder believes the enzymes could be changed in some plants to increase their ability to store water. The researchers added carbonic anhydrase genes to plants that do not react to higher levels of carbon dioxide. They observed that for every molecule of carbon dioxide taken in by the plants, they lost 44% less water. The scientists say the photosynthesis process continued normally in these plants. They say this suggests that changing plants to save more water will not affect plant growth. This method might be used to help engineer food crops that are resistant to extremely dry conditions. The discovery could help farmers meet a growing demand for food as water supplies decrease. However, the scientists say more research is needed. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. For transcripts, MP3s, and podcasts of our reports, visit us on the web at voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, welcome to Agriculture in Special English. How much of the world's food is going to waste? The Institution of Mechanical Engineers released a report that says as much as half of all food is wasted. The Britain-based group says that must change if the world is to feed its growing population. Every year, the world produces about 4 billion tons of food. The report says that between 1/3 and 1/2 of it goes to waste. It says that in Southeast Asian countries, between 37% and 80% of all rice production is lost. Colin Brown helped write the report for the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. He says a lot of rice is lost because of the way it is harvested, stored, and transported. The developed world also wastes food. The report says more efficient farming methods ensure that more food reaches markets. Still, Colin Brown says millions of tons of food are thrown away because it is past its sell-by date or for other reasons. He says a lot of food is thrown away because it no longer looks good and not because it is no longer good to eat. A spokesman for a group that represents supermarkets in Britain says the big food stores are not to blame. He says they are only following European Union marketing rules. The stores have been pushing for an easing of those rules. He says that in 2009, stores succeeded in getting a number of rules relaxed. Many aid organizations welcomed the report. They say it shows how much food is being wasted at a time when millions of people do not get enough to eat. The group Save the Children says there is enough food in the world to feed every child. Yet, 2.3 million children die every year as a result of hunger. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Generations of newcomers have brought their tastes and sometimes their farming skills to American soil. These include refugees who have gotten help from government agencies and private groups to grow crops on community farms. These farms and gardens can be found across the country. Bantu refugees from Somalia helped start the New Roots Community Farm in San Diego, California. Many of them did not have much money or much fresh produce in their lives. Some, especially young people, were eating unhealthy fast food. The refugees wanted to grow their own food. Cambodians and other groups in San Diego were in a similar situation. A community farm seemed like a good answer. The refugees got help from the group that had resettled many of them, the International Rescue Committee. But getting a permit to use some open land owned by the city took about 2 years. The New Roots Community Farm opened in 2009. The farm is almost 1 hectare. People can learn how to grow foods from back home, as well as traditional American crops. The growers sell some of their produce at a marketplace and to restaurants. One result of the community farm is that people are learning about foods from other people's homelands. First Lady Michelle Obama, who has her own vegetable garden at the White House, visited the farm in San Diego last year. A group called the Somali Bantu Zigwa Community has operated a farm for several years near Boise, Idaho. Dadiri Nuro is the group's president. He says, "We are farming people. We like to farm." Mr. Nuro came to the United States in 2004. He and his family had been living in a refugee camp in Kenya. He says more than 15 crops are grown without pesticides at the farm, including potatoes, tomatoes, kale, lettuce, cabbage, onion, and shallots. The farm also grows 2 kinds of corn. Mr. Nuro explains that we have African corn and we have American corn. Americans, they like soft corn, and the Bantu, we like hard corn. The community group sells some of its produce at a farmer's market and has now bought storage freezers. The group has also donated food to other communities. The Idaho State Office for Refugees has advice on its website about starting a community garden. You can find a link at voaspecialenglish.com. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. A United Nations report predicts that world rice production will be higher this year than last year. The report is from the Food and Agriculture Organization. The FAO says the global rice harvest should be almost 2% higher this year, mainly because of increased production in Asia. Large gains are expected in Bangladesh, Burma, China, India, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Thailand. Also, the FAO predicts a recovery for rice harvests in Africa. Production increases are expected to be led by Mali, Nigeria, and Senegal. In other parts of the world, the report predicts that rice harvests will be lower in the European Union and the United States. Two reasons for this are unusually dry weather and falling rice prices, which have led some farmers to plant other crops. Smaller rice harvests also are expected in Latin America and the Caribbean. Concepcion Calpe is an economist with the FAO. She says good harvests in Asia will lead to reduced demand in the global rice trade this year. Demand in global trade is expected to fall 900,000 tons to about 34 million metric tons. Ms. Calpe says one reason is because a lot of the major importers like Indonesia or the Philippines or even Bangladesh have harvested very good crops. Another reason is because some of them, like the Philippines, have set limits on how much they are willing to import. The FAO says prices for rice have stayed high for several reasons. These include higher costs for fuel, fertilizer, and, in some areas, labor. One country where prices remain high is China. Concepcion Calpe says the high prices raise questions about official Chinese reports of record harvests. In Thailand, a government price support program has led rice exports to fall by 20% to less than 8 million tons. The program keeps prices for Thai rice exports above market prices. As a result, the FAO says exporters like Australia, India, and Vietnam have captured a larger market share. Ms. Calpe notes that Burma could become a major exporter of rice. Many Western governments have eased trade restrictions on Burma recently because of its efforts at political and economic reform. Foreign investment and increased productivity in Cambodia might also help that country export more rice. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can read, listen, and learn English with more news about agriculture at voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Call it recession gardening or a product of the local foods movement. But whatever the reason, more Americans are growing some of their own food. Or at least they are trying to. Many need advice from experts like the master gardeners at the University of Maryland Extension Service. The Extension Service has launched Grow It, Eat It. This campaign is a response to what they call the huge new demand for information and help with home gardens. Master gardeners from throughout the state are helping less experienced people learn how to work the land. Food gardeners can join a network and put their garden on a map on the Extension Service website. The goal: 1 million food gardeners in Maryland producing their own affordable, healthy food. The current count of food gardeners is around 5,000 statewide. Nationally, sales of garden supplies increased last year as people started or expanded food gardens. Sales rose 30% at Burpee, a major seller of seeds. Shannon Dill is the extension agent for Talbot County, Maryland. She says the weak economy is not the only reason people are trying to grow their own food to save money. Prices for fruits and vegetables at the store are up. Shannon Dill finds that growing food at home usually costs less than buying it at stores or restaurants. She also finds that people seem to be staying home more, so they have more time to work in the garden. And she says people like to know where their food is coming from. But sometimes people choose the wrong plants for the local growing conditions, or they plant at the wrong time, or they plant seeds too close together, or in poor soil, or without enough daily sunlight. Master gardeners can help people avoid mistakes. Nancy Garrison started the first Master Gardener program in Santa Clara County, California, almost 30 years ago. She says organic material such as leaf mulch, also called leaf mold, can almost always improve poor soil. Once the soil is improved, she says, then worms can do a lot of your work for you. A vegetable garden in front of a house may not seem unusual in rural areas, but a lawyer who lives in suburban Maryland, outside Washington, grew squash, cucumbers, and tomatoes on his front lawn last year. How did his neighbors react? He says many of them congratulated him on his garden. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Russia's Pavlovsk Experimental Station houses one of the oldest seed and plant collections in the world. But in August, a court agreed to let the Russian Housing Development Foundation take control of the land. The Russian government established the foundation in 2008. The foundation wants to build housing on the land near St. Petersburg that the collection now occupies. Russian officials could still decide to rescue the station. If not, it could be gone within months. The station would not be at all easy to move, even if enough land could be found quickly. Most of the collection grows in the ground. Agricultural specialists say trying to transplant it would take years. The Pavlovsk Experimental Station is part of the N.I. Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry. The institute already existed as a research center when plant scientist Nikolai Vavilov reorganized it in the 1920s. The institute was named in his honor in 1930. The experimental station includes plants that are not found in any other seed bank. It also has Europe's largest field bank for fruits and berries. More than 100 varieties each of raspberries and gooseberries grow on its many hectares. The Global Crop Diversity Trust has been working to save the collection since it first appeared threatened. The trust, a food security group, has been urging people to appeal to Russian officials. An order from President Dmitry Medvedev or Prime Minister Vladimir Putin could stop the housing development. President Medvedev has started an investigation. The collection has been threatened before. During World War II, German troops surrounded St. Petersburg, then called Leningrad. Scientists protected the seeds and plants even as people starved. The Pavlovsk Experimental Station is one of an estimated 1,400 seed and plant preservation centers worldwide. Some have been damaged or destroyed by war, natural disasters, and theft. In 2008, Norway opened a so-called Doomsday Vault designed to be secure from any threat, even an asteroid strike. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is in the side of a mountain. The huge icy space holds extra copies of seeds from other seed banks. In February, it received its 500,000th seed variety to keep safe. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. You can read and listen to our programs and get podcasts at voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, this is Agriculture. The Go Green Initiative is a program for school children in the American city of Manassas, Virginia. It teaches earth-friendly behaviors, like recycling things, instead of throwing them away. 9-year-old Luis Delgado has learned why recycling is important. He says throwing things away without recycling makes the earth a dirtier place. Luis is one of more than 7,000 elementary school students taking part in the Go Green initiative. The program receives support from the city government. Sandy Thompson is the program's coordinator. She says the Manassas schools recycle almost everything, from telephones to plastic bags. The schools use single-stream recycling when possible. This means collecting paper, plastic, and glass in one container instead of separating them. Mike Moon is the city's director of Public Works and Utilities. He says the goal is to raise awareness about recycling to keep Manassas clean. But he adds that Go Green is not just about recycling. He says it is also about energy and water conservation. Boys and girls also learn about gardening and composting. Composting turns uneaten food and kitchen waste into rich organic matter. Mike Moon says children often have never experienced those methods commonly used in agriculture. Sandy Thompson says the lessons the children learn go beyond the classroom. She says they start their own gardens at home and recycle more. 10-year-old Maria Seberg planted a garden behind her home. She says she enjoys gardening and recycling because it helps the environment. Mike Moon says good recycling behavior, taught at a young age, will last a lifetime. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Prasuti.
I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Recycling programs usually give new life to materials like paper, metal, plastic, and glass. But a program in the eastern United States is recycling shellfish to help the Chesapeake Bay. Oysters are filter feeders, which means they help clean the water. At the same time, generation upon generation of oysters form reefs. These structures provide homes for fish and crabs. Oysters are a Chesapeake tradition, and they are good for the bay. But environmental damage and too much harvesting have cut the oyster population of the Chesapeake. An organization called the Oyster Recovery Partnership started the recycling program earlier this year. Baby oysters need to attach themselves to a shell or other hard surface as they grow. Scientists are using recycled shells as part of an oyster reproduction program. More than 50 restaurants, seafood dealers, and other businesses have joined the Oyster Shell Recycling Alliance. 2 states, Maryland and Virginia, are also taking part in the program. One of the restaurants involved is in Washington, near the White House. Oysters are a specialty at the Old Ebbitt Grill, and manager Christian Guidey says that means lots of shells. He says, "We serve between 1,500 and 3,000 oysters a day, and that obviously does create a lot of waste. But the restaurant no longer throws away all those shells. The Oyster Recovery Partnership takes them away for recycling. First, the shells get washed. Then, they go to the Center for Environmental Science at the University of Maryland for further processing. The shells are placed in tanks with hundreds of millions of oyster larvae. This way, the baby oysters can be raised until they have grown big enough to be moved to the Chesapeake. This year, the Oyster Recovery Partnership helped produce and plant more than 450 million baby oysters in the bay." Don Merritt heads the Oyster Recovery Program at the University of Maryland. He says the goal is not just to increase the oyster population. He says, "Our real goal here is to try to restore healthy oysters to the Chesapeake Bay so that we can help restore a healthy Chesapeake Bay." Mr. Merritt says it will take many years of work before the Chesapeake Bay has a good supply of oysters again. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can find our programs with transcripts and MP3s at voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. North Kivu is a war-torn province that used to be called the breadbasket of the Congo. Now, some farmers are being trained to increase their productivity with fertilizer. The International Fertility Development Center is supporting the project. The IFDC is a non-profit group based in the United States. The project includes planting trees. Trees help prevent the loss of soil through erosion. They also provide charcoal for fuel, and they provide fertilizer in the form of leaves. Other farmers are experimenting with chemical fertilizer. The farmers use a mixture of chemical and organic fertilizer. They also use improved seed. They say they have succeeded in growing 3 or 4 times as much maize, rice, beans, and potatoes. The fertilizer costs around $1.30 a kilo. But workers from the IFDC say if it triples a yield of potatoes, for example, it means twice the profit. Farmer Adrian Kangele says the new methods promoted by the group could be a solution to ethnic conflicts in the Kivu region. Fertilizer brings peace, he says, because more people can earn a living from the soil. One of the trainers, Sandra Kavira Kawise, says fertilizer can even save marriages. She says in one area, many of the men had left their wives and gone to work in the mines. Then their wives started using fertilizer and their yields of rice tripled. The IFDC has found that when the men work with the women, the harvests are 9 tons a hectare compared with 6 tons when the women work alone. Dutch scientist Henk Bremen designed the fertilizer project. He says the Democratic Republic of Congo uses less chemical fertilizer per hectare than any other country. Mr. Bremen suggests that one reason is a lack of government policy. Another is the influence of donors and international non-governmental organizations that for about 20 years were against more intensive ways of farming. Edwige Mongwana Kavor is a local agronomist who works for Mercy Corps, an NGO. She says she is not against adding chemical fertilizer to organic matter, but she says land can become dependent on chemical fertilizers, and the chemicals can pollute groundwater. Henk Bremen agrees that farmers should mix the fertilizer with organic fertilizer. But he says there is a much bigger risk from soil erosion in the Kivu region. Farmers' groups have welcomed a promise from the DRC government to end taxes on fertilizers. Those taxes are some of the highest in Central Africa. For VOA Special English, I'm Mario Ritter.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Less than a third of people in developing countries own or have any official right to the land they live on. Development experts say gaining land rights is important for reducing poverty and increasing economic growth and food production. Poor people can then use the land as security to get bank loans. Land records can also show foreign investors that the land and the rights of those on it are legally secure. Foreign demand has increased in recent years for agricultural land in Africa, Asia, and South America. UN Habitat official Clarissa Augustinus in Nairobi, Kenya, says when an investor goes to the government and says, "I want a piece of land," the government looks on their maps which show that that particular piece of land is empty, and they give it to an investor. But when the investor goes there and looks at the land, he sees that it is fully occupied by a tribe or a family or whatever. Forcing the people off the land can harm the investor's image. Ms. Augustinus says ownership documents like deeds and titles are rare because establishing property lines and recording land is expensive. UN Habitat says the answer for some countries is to create a series of steps in gaining land rights, a so-called property ladder. First, people could receive a simple document or starter title to the land they are on. They would be safe from the threat of being forced off the land by the state or wealthy buyers. Higher steps would provide greater rights. Finally, a majority of a community could decide to allow individual ownership of the land. Namibia, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia are among the countries adopting property ladders. Ms. Augustinus says Ethiopia has already provided 20 million land certificates on the lower end of the property ladder for about $1 each. In Southeast Asia, the United States Agency for International Development is working on a project to help Timor-Leste develop property rights. The first step is an official certificate recognizing a landholder's unopposed claim. East Timor separated from Indonesia in 1999. The Indonesian army had destroyed land records and forced communities from their land to break up resistance. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You find live English lessons Monday through Friday at the VOA Learning English page on Facebook. You can also read, listen, and learn with MP3s and texts of stories at voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. This June in Brazil, delegates will mark the 20th anniversary of what is commonly known as the Earth Summit. The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development took place in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. One of the issues that the delegates plan to discuss in June at Rio +20 is the role of agriculture in climate change. A recent article written by a team of scientists says agriculture should be a top priority in climate change negotiations. It says there was some progress in this area, but not much, at the United Nations Climate Conference in December in Durban, South Africa. The article, What Next for Agriculture After Durban, appeared in the journal Science. Britain's chief scientific advisor, Sir John Bennington, led the international team that wrote it to try to influence policymakers. Molly John from the University of Wisconsin-Madison was one of those authors. She says efforts to guarantee food security are falling short in significant ways that have come to our attention, especially recently with the significant price shocks. Prices on the world market have remained high since the food crisis of 2007 and 2008. Professor Jean says agriculture is a major producer of greenhouse gases blamed for trapping heat in the atmosphere. But agriculture also offers ways to lessen their effects with known and proven farming practices. She says agriculture is threatened by climate change, especially in vulnerable parts of the world. But agriculture also represents an opportunity to better manage meeting our needs while we reduce the emissions of various greenhouse gases that are accumulating in the atmosphere. Professor Jean says moving toward climate-smart agriculture should be at the center of policy considerations. The scientists call for reducing the huge amount of food that gets wasted or goes bad before it can be eaten. Another recommendation is to plant more crops that put less pressure on the environment. The article says the integration of agriculture in the climate change negotiating process has been moving slowly. At the same time, climate change and population growth have been moving much faster. The article calls on scientists to play a bigger part in the issue by making sure climate change negotiators have clear data available. Such information, they say, could help increase investment in agriculture. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Prisuti.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. What can you do with earthworms? Some people use the creepy crawlers to catch fish, but others put worms to work making compost. Compost looks and feels like good soil. Gardeners and farmers add it to soil to make plants grow better. You can make compost from food waste at home with or without the help of worms. How the worms help is by first eating and processing the food. It comes out the other end of the worm as rich compost. Kim Gable from the University of Florida Extension Service in Key West says worms known as red wigglers are the best varieties to use. You need a container to hold the waste and the worms. The size of the composting bin depends on how much compost you want to make. You need about 1 kilogram of worms for each half a kilogram of daily food waste that you add. Kim Gable says the bin needs holes so the worms can breathe. And they also like to be in the dark, so cover the bin to keep out the light. One thing worms do not like is very high temperatures. Kim Gable lives in the warm climate of southern Florida. She keeps her worm bin indoors. Unpleasant smells can be prevented by controlling the amount of food waste added to the bin and avoiding meat or bones. For composting with worms, you need bedding that is moist but not too wet. The amount of water you add will depend on the bedding material you use. Kim Gable uses newspaper cut into strips about 2.5 centimeters wide. Add 2 handfuls of soil for every half square meter of bedding material and mix well. Spread the worms over the bedding. The worms will start to wriggle their way down. Remove any worms that remain on top of the bedding after 2 hours. When you feed the worms, place the food about 2.5 centimeters below the surface of the bedding and cover it. The worms' waste, or castings, should be ready to use as compost within 2 to 6 months. To remove the compost, you can push it all to one side of the bin. Place new bedding and food on the other side. Within a few weeks, the worms will move to the new bedding. Now you can remove the compost and fill the empty space with new bedding. For VOA Special English, I'm Mario Ritter. For more gardening advice, and for more programs and activities for English learners, go to voaspecialenglish.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and iTunes at VOA Learning English. This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. People have been growing chrysanthemums for more than 2,000 years. Mums make bright and colorful gardens. People in China and other Asian cultures make tea with the flowers. Giacomo Puccini, the great Italian composer, even named one of his works after chrysanthemums, Chrysanthemi. One basic kind of mum is the hardy or garden mum. The other basic kind is the florist mum. The garden mum is better able to handle different growing conditions. There are many varieties of mums. The decorative mum is often seen in gardens. Another popular type, the quill mum, has long, straight petals like a tube or needle. Chrysanthemum blooms can be white, yellow, golden, red, or other colors. The plants often grow 1 meter high. The soil for chrysanthemums should be kept moist but well drained so it does not get too wet. Newly planted mums should be watered 2 or 3 times a week, depending on conditions. Plants established in the ground may do well just within normal rainfall. Mums grow best in full sunshine. They produce colorful blooms when days get shorter and nights get longer. The life cycle of the plant depends on the amount of daylight. This is why experts advise against placing mums near night lights or street lights. The light may interfere with their normal growth cycle. The plants may develop buds too soon. In climates where temperatures fall below freezing, plant mums at least 6 weeks before the first frost is expected. That way, the plants will be well established for cold weather. Placing mulch around the plants can protect them from the cold. Consider using straw or shredded leaves for the mulch. The material will also add nutrients to the soil. Some gardeners say the most beautiful presentation comes from planting mums close together. But be sure to leave enough space to let air flow between the plants. If not, there may be a greater chance of disease. To get more blooms, gardeners pinch back the branches when new growth has reached 15 centimeters. Squeeze about 5 to 7 centimeters off each branch. Pinch it again when a branch grows another 12 to 15 centimeters. Stop the pinching about 100 days before you want the plants to bloom. For VOA Special English, I'm Mario Ritter. For more gardening advice, along with activities for learning English, go to voaspecialenglish.com.